49. The last president inaugurated in the United States. The span of terrible days after the global comms blackout when the world was reshaped. The number of strange supernatural phenomena that appear around the globe. You're listening to The 49, the new series by Andrew Kooman. Get the content right in your inbox when you subscribe at the49.substack.com. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Welcome to the world of The 49.
When she returned to the room at the governor's mansion on the Bow, Boyer found a folded piece of paper on one of the pillows of the king-sized bed. She unfolded the page. At the top were the governor's initials. A simple illustration of a rocket was in the bottom corner. In the middle of the page were two words, one printed above the fold, the other below. Stay nearby. Her first thought was, where could I go? There wasn't really any place in or out of Corridor West that would be outside of his reach. Now that she was in his mansion, there'd be 100 ways he could track her from the moment she stepped outside the doors. Except the Phos. The Phos was the only place his surveillance couldn't penetrate. She had permission to go to and from the territory that the chat rooms had designated as one of the 49 supernatural wonders of the world. She could travel to and from the Phos in a matter of hours if she needed to, if she didn't linger. Stay nearby, she knew, meant stay away from there. The whole corridor was on alert. They hadn't discussed it, but she wondered if the trips would change. Boyer served as a sort of liaison or tour guide between the corridor and the elders at Masquatchees ever since the bishop died. There were only a few people whose names the bishop had offered to the governor as trusted successors of his legacy. Names he told her he was shown in glory to fulfill this purpose. It was one she still didn't quite understand, but one that was becoming clearer. Her fingers and feet still burned with the sensation, a direct echo from the glory of the Phos. It felt like cold air lightly blew across her skin, like her feet had been rubbed with menthol. When she felt this, especially outside the territory of the Phos, she paid attention. She remembered the image she received when she quietly rested in prayer and adoration in the small chapel in Masquatchees that had been the place she spent the most time with the bishop. She liked to sit on a wooden pew and look out the stained glass window of Kateri Tekakwitha. She who bumps into things was the name her tribe had affectionately given her, the bishop told her. She had inquired about the striking image of the young brown woman portrayed in the glass. The woman hugged herself, her left hand clutched over her breast, her right hand holding up a small gold cross. She seemed to almost float in the air. Her moccasined feet had golden laces, and the white tunic she wore had flecks of gold. Behind her, a small canoe could be seen in a blue tributary that disappeared into a mountain range. Boyer, meet Lily of the Mohawks, the first indigenous saint. Benedict canonized her. Boyer always took courage from Tekakwitha's story. Her mother, Kahenta, was captured when their Algonquin village was ransacked by a Mohawk tribe and taken from her family and people across the river to their homeland in the lands east of what used to be known as Montreal. The young girl also had scars. They marked her face and affected her sight, but she got out lucky. Tekakwitha lost all her family members to smallpox. Like you, the girl survived, scars and all, the bishop said to her. It meant everything at the time. I commissioned this special glass for this chapel. On some mornings, the sun catches those gold flecks just so, and if you stand over by the altar, the light dances. Sometimes Boyer imagined meeting Tekakwitha, throwing rocks with her from the shore of the river she seemed to float above in the glass. Boyer was never one to petition saints. She let the bishop ask them to pray for her if he felt so inclined. But she thought many times how much she'd like to hear Tekakwitha tell her own stories, the things the saint bumped into, get to know the real woman whose story was distilled and mythologized over time, set like a stone in colorful glass. Less than a day ago, she had sat in the dancing golden light when a series of images played before her mind in the Phos. Time in that chapel was different. It gave the earthbound soul a taste of the assertion that a day is like 1,000 years to God. The 10 or so hours she spent in quiet meditation passed like a snap. She was conscious but half asleep. The room was a comfortable temperature, so she wasn't cold, and yet it felt as though she was sitting in a meat locker. Somehow, without shivering, her feet and hands felt like solid ice. She had wondered at this a lot, even asked the bishop about it, since not everyone experienced it the same. The Spirit of God has always hovered, was how he explained it. We live in a world where all our senses are not fully alive. You're feeling a spill over of glory, which isn't just a concept, my dear. It's a very real thing with physical attributes. Boyer sat on a pew near the stream of sunlight that shone through the Tekakwitha window. Golden flecks of light seemed to dance on the floor, even as she watched them move like two-dimensional flames on the stone floor in her mind. She started to see the walls of the chapel move on either side of her. Slowly at first, then they throttled. The panes of glass were blurs of quilt-like patterns. Reds, blues, purples, greens. The story of the saints, famous stories of the Bible, the pastoral scenes of delight were moving so fast now, the walls were streaks of color. When she looked to the left or the right, she could sometimes make out the shape of the window frame. The glass was now gone, and in the frames were the saints themselves, alive. Elijah perched on the sill, the long staff he held in his hand outside the building, his wool robe and long beard floating in the wind, created by the moving walls. He waved, not at her, but to the other side of the small chapel, so Boyer turned. Tekakwitha waved back at him, removing her hand momentarily from her breast to raise her hand. In greeting, Tekakwitha didn't wave at Elijah, though. She waved at the bishop. He stood near the altar, dressed in a simple white robe. Boyer looked at him, overcome with love for the man. A man she missed every day, the closest thing she'd ever had to a father. He invited her to the altar, and she stepped toward it. Even now, as she thought about it from where she sat on the bed in the governor's mansion on the bow, the memory sent a chill up her spine. It all seemed to happen in her mind's eye, but she had a memory of it in her body. The Phos was spectacular in this way. She had stepped up to the altar and received the bread and the wine bannock and Saskatoon berry juice. When she put down the chalice, she realized they weren't the stained, glassed walls of the stone chapel that were moving, but the metal frame of the beast chortling down the tracks. She was in the terrible vehicle again. All around her, where pews used to be, young girls and boys huddled together on the floor. Here and there, women stretched out in their hospital gowns inside glass medical pods, clearly pregnant and clearly in drug-induced sleep. The kids looked up at her, silent. They were dressed in white boxer shorts and white t-shirts like contestants of the game. They sat hugging their knees to their chests, looking out the window toward the stars. Their eyes didn't quite register or focus. They looked dazed, altered. Boyer looked back at the bishop to seek an explanation, but he was no longer there. In his place stood the governor, dressed in black. His hands were behind his back. He wore the bishop's crucifix around his neck. Without thinking, she reached for the cross and ripped it off his neck. The leather loop broke easily. The moment she held it in her hand, Boyer and all the children, as well as the women in cryo-sleep in the medical pods, started to float off the ground. The gov stayed, unmoving, as though his feet were nailed to the floor. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she spun. It was the new bishop from the game. He floated in the air beside her. He was shirtless, and the scar on his abdomen was bleeding. The drops of blood didn't fall to the ground, though. They floated up. She followed one that came close to her lips, as it brushed her cheek and floated above her. It was absorbed into a great big blob that formed all along the ceiling of the beast. The red drops of blood mingled with a gray-blue blob of tears she knew the children had cried as they hurtled toward their destination. The new bishop of Masquachese, the man who didn't live in the Phos territory, but ministered behind the walls of the corridor, looked at the cross in her hand. She grabbed hold of his hand and pulled herself toward him in the 0G. She tied the cross around his neck. The crucifix floated between them, and she pulled it down, placing it against his chest. The moment she did, every eye in the room snapped to her. The opaque veil that seemed to cloud all the children's vision was cleared, and their pupils narrowed, as though they could see. The eyes of the women in the medical pods opened, and all heads turned to her. The new bishop squinted at her, as though he was seeing her for the first time. Boyer had walked out of the chapel after that vivid vision. The door to the room opened, and a house droid stood in the frame. "Here is the key to your new apartment. The location and details have been sent in an alert." The droid placed the card in her hand. "You are free to leave." It turned and left the room. The door remained open. Boyer sat still on the bed, though her heart still seemed to hurtle toward the disquieting place the beast was hurtling toward in the dream. We, all of us, desire a clear path. She could hear the bishop's voice, like he was in the room. Words he'd said to her many times. The Lord determines the steps. Boyer looked at the empty doorframe where the droid had just stood. It felt more like the Gov was directing her steps right now. She slipped the key card into her pocket. She had to find the new bishop.
Thanks for listening to this portion of The 49 by Andrew Kooman. New content drops for paid subscribers every Monday at the49.substack.com. That's the49.substack.com. On Tuesdays, we release new audio on all your favorite podcast platforms. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe and to share it with a friend. Thanks for listening to The 49.